Greetings. In this video, I'll be covering the topic of alternative history and how in the anime Code Geass, we see a modern representation of the colonize or be colonized argument of Imperialist Japan. Now, before we go into the anime itself, I would like to give a brief overview of Japanese history as a colonizing power in their colonial project. So most historians will agree that there are two main instances before the Meiji Restoration, which was the starting point of the colonial project that kind of influenced the colonial project to occur. The first of those being the Opium Wars, and the second and more influential being the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry in Edo Bay. So prior to the 19th century and from basically the Edo period in the early 17th century through the Meiji Restoration, Japan had been very closed off from the rest of the world, and it's through the victory by the British in the Opium Wars against China and then the arrival of Commodore Perry that really made the Japanese see how advanced the Western powers were, how much of a threat they presented to Japan's sovereignty in the coming years, especially considering how much influence Western powers already had in the region as it was. So what we get from this is the Meiji Restoration, of course, and the main argument is that Japan had to become a strong imperial nation so that they could expand their empire and colonize themselves in order to not be colonized by the other Western powers. In doing so, they created a vast sphere of influence in the Pacific and East Asia, and in doing so created one of the most influential empires in the Far East. As history would tell us, in their process of acquiring many territories from the Meiji Restoration, starting with the acquisition of Hokkaido, through the Pacific War and their expansion into the Asian mainland continent, depictions that the Japanese used to represent the colonial project and how the colonized nations felt about the Japanese colonial project was very different and rather stark sometimes. The dichotomy in regimes of representation is very evident across Japanese colonial history and is also very evident in the anime Code Geass, The Lucia the Rebellion, which I will be getting into now. So to start, we have a little history with the anime. It's given in the first episode in the opening sequence. It discusses how Japan in the year 2010, and by the way, the anime was released in 2006. This happens in a near future timeline. Anyway, so it's how the nation of Japan was invaded and fought a bloody war with the Britannian Empire. Britannia is a portmanteau of Britain and the Americas, Britain, America, Britannia. The Britannian Empire is composed of the Americas, and we see our first major regime of representation here and how the Japanese have presented the West. Britain and America were two major colonizing and imperial powers during the time of the Japanese colonial project, probably the most two prominent to people in Asia as they had a lot of influence. So the name portmanteau, rather Britannia, it's very basic but very definitive definition of a outside colonizing power. So I think that's one thing that's pretty obvious right off the bat. In the invasion of Japan, Britannia has far superior weapons technologies, and in the invasion they treated the Japanese very poorly, committing several atrocities and showing very little regard for Japanese customs or even Japanese life. This was one of the main arguments used by pro-Meiji reformists during the beginnings of the colonial project, pointing to other Asian countries as the prime example of why they need to become an imperialist colonizing nation themselves, because if not, this is exactly what would happen to them, what happened to other Asian nations, and what is depicted in the anime, being overtaken by the superior weapons technologies of a Western power and being subjugated to their iron fist, as you would have it, is exactly what happened to them if they did not become the empire that history showed us that they would become. Moreover, we can also see how the Britannians employed many similar tactics that the Japanese, ironically enough, employed themselves, and argue what would have happened to them, nevertheless, was they were stripped of a lot of their cultural identity, a lot of their traditional attire, which I'll be getting into in a little bit, and practices, names, history. A lot of that was stripped in the invasion by Britannia, and even the name of the country, Japan, no longer was used. They became the 11th conquered domain of the Britannian Empire, and as such, they were given the name Area 11, and the people were called 11s, no longer Japan with Japanese citizens. So moving on into, as I mentioned a little bit previously, with apparel and then character design, that's the other major regime of representation that we see here. One of many, but definitely one of the major ones. If you look at the top half of this slide, you'll see the Britannian character designs. On the bottom half, the 11s or Japanese character designs. In the upper half, we see, at least on the right side, those are two of the antagonists, two of the Britannian monarchs. We see the character design is very proto-European, very Eurocentric Western features, with the hairstyle, with the attires, very resemblant of the Victorian era, very along the lines of how the Japanese viewed like Western monarchs. It's the typical stereotypical schemata of Western military rulers and monarchs, and we see that also with the uniforms of the policemen, the royal guard of the Britannian Empire. Those uniforms are very resemblant of United States and British and even arguably German uniforms from World War II. They incorporate many similar elements, so you can make the argument that a lot is drawn upon from the experiences in World War II here, and from the era of the Meiji Restoration and the attire of the elitist ruling class of the Britannian Empire. Then we look down at the Japanese, and there's a few very notable differences. One, the clothing style is a lot less fantastical. It's very basic, very plain, but it is still Western, which shows two things. One, the Japanese or 11s have become very poor, but they've also been indoctrinated into Western culture. Obviously, Japan had become very westernized by the release of this anime. It wasn't too long ago, but even still, we see a very poor Western kind of attire, and this is seen throughout the anime. The only major exceptions to this amongst 11s who do not wear this kind of attire is the resistance movement. And actually, among them, we have the most important differences, and two of them are kind of shown here. The first being with the kind of more warrior active like clothing, kind of like almost like the jumpsuits or the uniforms that are like more kind of resemblant of a rebellion resistance movement, and then even more so with the headbands. You can kind of see some significance there, not only with being the color red, but the fact they are headbands that's been used by the Japanese military. You can see that with kamikazes. The headbands show a lot of significance in warrior ethos, so it's kind of speaking volumes to the fact that even under this oppressive regime, the Japanese warrior ethos, that spirit, has not died out, and those resistance fighters carry that even through this day. So moving on, while there are a few other regimes of representation here that I can talk about through the course of the anime due to time constraints of this video, I'm going to go over the last major one, and that's just kind of with the world order, especially in Asia, that is presented in the anime. So the main three ruling empires, as you would have it, are Britannia, which is in blue on this map, the Chinese Federation, which is in red, and then the Euro-African universe, which is in yellow. This is taken from the end of the anime. I couldn't find an earlier one. The yellow covered more, but Britannia was able to defeat them. So looking at the Chinese Federation, which is in red, there's something very significant with this. And that is that the Chinese Federation, that's headquartered in China, obviously, and they're the main ruling class or country that controls the Greater Federation. One of the main arguments, part of the Pan-Asianist movement in Japan and in the Far East during the age of Japan's colonial project in Imperialist Japan, is how the West had influenced the Far East and the Pacific to a great deal as it was by the turn of the 20th century. And none of Asia was powerful enough to resist that influence or was powerful enough to stop them, other than, of course, the Japanese. In this alternative timeline, Japan obviously has been conquered because they did not modernize to the extent that the West had, even though they clearly had. They had not kept up with them, as we see from the superior technology to warfighting that Britannia displayed. China is the Asian superpower here, and even though they have acquired a vast territory, spoiler alert, they end up being still overtaken by the Britannian Empire. Here's what happens. So the Chinese Federation's leadership is inept, and the leader is greedy, and not to say of all of them, but the majority of them, and their growth is not sustainable, and eventually they crumble from internal conflicts, and the Holy Britannian Empire is able to come in and defeat them. Japan argued during its colonial project that the rest of Asia would not be able to defend themselves against the West, and that they would eventually be overtaken anyway, and that Japan, being Asian and promoting the Asia for Asians argument, that they should be the one to protect the rest of Asia from Western influence, lest they fall to the Western powers anyway and become colonies of them, as opposed to being a productive member of the Japanese Empire itself. So to recap, in the anime Code Geass, we see a number of regimes of representation that play into the overall narrative of Japan had no choice but to become an imperialist nation, but to colonize for the means of self-preservation and to not become colonized themselves. We see this in how Britannia, the preeminent Western power, is depicted, and the atrocities and general lack of regard for human life outside of Britannian life in Japan, and how they very poorly treat people who are not originally Britannian. We see this in the character design, how we see a huge disparity between the elitist ruling class of Britannia and then the poor, common, everyday 11 or Japanese in Area 11. And then we also see this with the Chinese Federation being the main power in Asia and how they ultimately were not able to stand up to the West, unlike in the colonial era of Japan, where Japan was the primary power and they believed that they were the ones to be able to defeat the West. So all of these arguments support the premise of that Japan needed to be the preeminent country in Asia for the sake of the self-preservation of not just Japan, but all of Asia being free from colonization by the Western powers. And with that, that ends this video on alternative history and why the anime Code Geass supports the Japanese imperialist narrative of colonize or be colonized. ありがとうございました。 Greetings! In this video I'll be covering the topic of alternative history and how in the anime Code Geass we see a modern representation of the colonized or be colonized